I'm Ken Moss, Harriet Orchi Meyer, Professor of Modern Jewish History at the University of Chicago. I'm very pleased to welcome you all and to introduce our guest today, Professor Guy Miron. Professor Miron works on wide swaths of modern Jewish history with a particular focus on German and Central European Jewish history in the 20th century, Hungarian Jewish history, Holocaust studies, and contemporary Jewish and Israeli historiographies of European Jewish modernity. He teaches modern Jewish history at the Open University in Israel, where he's been chair of the history department and executive vice president for academic affairs. And he directs the Center for the Study and Research of the Holocaust in Germany at the International Institute for Holocaust Research at Yad Vashem. He's published widely and deeply. Key publications include his 2004 German Jews in Israel, Memories and Past Images, a first groundbreaking monograph on the 1930s, his 2011 The Waning of Emancipation, Jewish History, Memory, and the Rise of Fascism in Germany, France, and Hungary, which just came out in English from Wayne State and in the Hebrew version from the Shazar Center. Finalist for the 2012 Yad Vashem International Book Prize for Holocaust Research. Other important publications, among many, we might mention the Yad Vashem Encyclopedia of the Ghetto During the Holocaust, 2009, finalist for the National Jewish Book Award, and two essential co-edited special issues volumes on anti-Semitism, co-edited with Scott Uri, first in the flagship Jewish History Journal in Israel, Tzion, 2020, and in 2024 in English, Anti-Semitism and the Politics of History. There are many more publications of note, but obviously I want to end with the one that brings us together here today, Professor Miron's recent book, Space and Time Under Persecution, The German Jewish Experience in the Third Reich. Supported by a coveted Israel Science Foundation grant, the Hebrew version appeared in 2021, and the revised English language version from University of Chicago Press appeared in 2023. Guy's going to say a few words about the book here at the podium, but then we're going to turn to a discussion. Let me also introduce our other more local guests. Advance of that part of the discussion. Joining us to talk with Guy today about this important book are two University of Chicago scholars, bring to bear their own formidable and many-sided expertise on German Jewish and European Jewish history and experience, and not least the Jewish experience of Nazism and the Holocaust. Leora Auslander is the Arthur and Joanne Rasmussen Professor in the Department of Race, Diaspora, and Indigeneity, and the Department of History. Centering on France and Germany, but global in scope, her many award-winning scholarship has taken many directions, but here of most note, I think, is her work on German and French Jewish history, and particularly, as she puts it, quote, work at the intersection of Jewish history and material culture, end quote. Key works in this realm include the 2002 Jewish Taste, Jews and the Aesthetics of Everyday Life in Paris and Berlin, 1933 to 1942, Coming Home, Jews in Post-War Paris, Contemporary History in 2005, and Archiving a Life, Post-Shoah Paradoxes of Memory Legacies, among many others. And then also joining us will be Naama Rokem, Associate Professor in the Department of Comparative Literature, where she's currently chair, and Near Eastern Languages and Cultures. She is equally a scholar of modern Hebrew literature and modern German Jewish literature and culture, as well as a scholar of translation theory and praxis, space and memory, Hannah Arendt, and the list goes on. Among her many publications and projects, I note her dazzling 2013 book, Prosaic Conditions, Heine and the Space of Zionist Literature from Northwestern, and two books very soon to appear, if they haven't already, at least first in volume 6, 4.
I don't know when I say
volume.
Not quite so soon either.
The critical edition of the complete works of Hannah Arendt, essays and short writings, of which Naama is co-editor.
I think it's going to end up being 6.2.
Volume 6.2. And a second monograph now complete, I say, Dispatches in Translation, tentatively titled Dispatches in Translation, a German Hebrew Epistolary Network, which is both a foundational work on early Israeli literature and its politics, and not least a study of the afterlives and after effects of the German Jewish synthesis in post-Holocaust culture. So we'll hear now from Professor Miron, and then we'll have a chance to hear from the discussion and a chance for questions.
Thank you very much, Ken, for this kind of introduction, also, of course, for the invitation here. I would really like to be very brief, just to tell you a little about how this book came to being, and if you're really interested, there's no other choice, you have just to read it. And we'll talk about different aspects of the book. We heard kind of, I think, interesting discussion from different perspectives. So, as Ken said, I published so far 2 previous monographs. This is the third one. And after finishing the previous one, I was looking for a new topic. I think it's a long process. I really believe in what we call slow scholarship in humanities. I think that one good monograph needs approximately a decade of formation, a process of thinking, of talking to people, of learning from other projects, of publishing one article and then the other one. So my first idea after a lot of reflections was I was very interested in Jewish calendars. This was the departure point of this whole project, because I saw a lot of articles in Jewish journals talking about the new way in which German Jews conceptualized and interpreted and related to Jewish holidays under the Nazi regime. So I started reading about it, and I think that the process, at least my process of getting to write such a book, was a process of, you work on the sources, you read secondary literature, and also you follow other works of people because you were part of a wider academic universe. So while beginning to write, to think about the calendars, it took me some time to realize that calendars is only one element of the bigger question of time. Yeah. For example, I encountered Elisheva Karlebach book, Palaces of Time, dealing a lot with Jewish calendars. Different books about calendars of time in England, in France, in different other concepts. And then I understood that the basic question is time, and calendars is only one aspect of it. And when you understand this, you come back to the sources, and then you see that time is offering many other perspectives, which has to do with memory, with the pace of time, and probably talk about it. And when I continued and I read a lot about sociology of time, and found different subdisciplines in social and cultural studies covering this topic of time, you realize that time goes with space. I mean, there's no other way to do it. And if you want to have a complete version of what I try to reflect in this context, and nobody actually did it before in my specific context, space should be also part of it. And also to show you how I think we have to be open to different influences and not to be, German Jewish scholar or Holocaust scholar or Jewish scholar, and not to be open to all different contingencies that we have in academic life. I remember that 7 or 10 years ago, I happened to be in a talk of 2 anthropologists. They were analyzing the Tel Aviv Central bus station. And they're analyzing through space and time. And so it was so inspiring, and say, why can't I take their methodology and use it for a totally different case study? And this was, again, one more starting point of the book. Now, while working on time and space, it took me more time and space, I would say, to see what will be the subdivisions of this book. I mean, now there's 3 chapters to each part, and it seems very, very systematically organized, but it was a very long process. I mean, the first part, dealing with space, is beginning with what I called public space, or a variety of public spaces, and they are discussed with the exclusion of German Jews from a variety of public spaces, and the way they try to come to terms with this, the way they're experiencing it, and what's a key point in the whole book is the way they express the agency in this context, how they try to come with this, and we'll probably give different examples while discussing. Just one example of the process I went through, I was using extensively the diaries of Victor Klemperer. After considering this, because initially I said, I'm dealing 20 years with German Jewish history. Before this, I didn't really get into Klemperer's diaries. And so many other scholars, much more experienced with a high reputation, wrote about Klemperer. So what's new to find in his diaries? But when I came to it from my perspective and my questions, I realized that his experience of driving is a fascinating case study for me dealing with space, and all the scholars who wrote about Klemperer's Jewish identity or cultural activities or political views did not care about his driving experience. But for me, this was the thing, and it was just an example. The second chapter is dealing with Jewish spaces, and I found that both through Jewish press and with the legal documents that some of the major Jewish spaces, first and foremost synagogues and cemeteries, are reinvented and used in a totally different way than they were used before. And the third chapter, which is, I would say, my favorite in the first part of the book, is a chapter about the domestic space, about home. And this is an opportunity to say that, in a way, this was also a very personal book, not because I'm a German Jew. I don't come from a German Jewish family, and of course, I'm not Holocaust survivors or refugee. I come from a different background. but I experience a problem of home, like each one of us, asking myself, what is the meaning of home? Does it have to be with a certain space, with my certain belongings and artifacts, with people I share my space with? It's I think, universal questions, and the German Jews, in our case, in very radical case study, are a very radical case study of this wider question. So, and while writing this book in a long process of years, I experienced different personal experiences of that has to do with home, like each of the people sitting here or watching the Zoom, because this is part of living. And the second part, dealing with time, begins with a calendar, which I found a very interesting, not only in the case of Jewish calendars, but also Nazi calendars, and the way in which Jews are integrated or excluded from the German society. Then I came to a chapter which for me was demanded a lot of reflection. It was about the pace of time. Is time going very, very fast or very, very slow? It has to do with this Bergson idea of durée instead of time in a more mechanistic way. And again, I find it very inspiring, and we'll talk about the way I try to use theory in my writing. And the last part was dealing with the Jewish historical memory, and also the way the individuals, the private people writing the legal documents, recreated their memory and their personal life and re-narrated them under these harsh circumstances.
So there are many things to talk about, as you already suggested, and I actually wanted to start, and this, I think, will segue well for some of Naama's concerns about the question of, I mean, method in a big sense, that is the relationship among theory, historical context, historical texts, the way you use them in the book, and the way both the mobilization of them as your scholarly process, and what you were learning from what, in a sense, but also as an expert in the question of exposition. So your choices, your narrative choices, your choices about how to write. Because one of the things that's striking when you all read the book that you will see is Guy moves very beautifully between the citations from heavily diaries, but not only diaries, newspaper materials, memoirs. I mean, there's a huge range of primary sources that you allow to speak. But then you also then move to a kind of both a German context and then a broader historical context, mostly in a kind of broad narrative. And then with theoretical references kind of coming in from various angles. And it all kind of coexists rather thoroughly interleaved throughout the book. And I found that an interesting strategy. It's an interesting rhetorical strategy. And I mean, I think that the scholarly practice of moving among those different kinds of materials is pretty common among historians. I mean, there are some who don't believe in using theory, but among those of us who do, but then the question of whether you actually present the theories and the theories authors, systematically throughout, as opposed to just letting it, inform how you're writing and then sticking in the and so I was curious about that and why why you do that. And then there are questions about which theorists, but let me stop there. It's like, so, okay. Yeah. So how did you, because one last thing on that, which is simply that there's also one of the things that's fascinating as you read it is the same people keep reappearing. So Klempera, I mean, it's not just, but that you get a sense of them in one kind. So you allow them to speak, but they're being mobilized for your argument.
Yeah.
And so they're fragmented into the way they fit within your arguments, which doesn't feel like violence to them. So I'm not saying that critically, but it's and it doesn't feel repetitive at all. It's that you're following them, but you're also leading them, I guess, in some ways. And so it's using them. I didn't want to go to that verb, and mobilizing, yeah, maybe. So could you just say more about that?
Okay, I'll just elaborate about it. I mean, I think that when a historian is coming to such a project or each parallel project, there are basically three different pillars, three different dimensions. There's sources, context, and theory. And you have to maneuver between the three. I mean, some historians are working only on the sources. So they just, if you get to work just summing up the sources, so what did he or she do? I mean, we can read the sources themselves. It's sometimes, some of the more not so interesting stuff of some historians of previous generation, you just see, they just bring you the sources, they put them in a book. There's a context. The context is crucial. This happened when this and this and this happened, and this is the context I'm writing about. I think you have to use it. And then comes theory. And I think in theory, historians, unlike people from a variety of social sciences, I have to be more careful about literature because I might be wrong here, but I think at least some of the people dealing with literature are very obliged to specific theories. I mean, I have my questions and problems, and I have my sources, and then I could go to a variety of theories and just pick what can be useful for me. And it's not necessarily that I used Descartes instead of Foucault in this context. I didn't consider it very, very deeply. Is it better or worse to do it? I find it useful. In this context, I think using is a good verb that I can work with. I mean, I also want my book to be used for other projects. I might also add that I also referred a lot to other historians that worked in a similar way on parallel projects. Now, the question about the outcome, how it looks. I mean, there could be an option not to refer at all to the theory in my text and just, put it into the footnote. But what I felt that while mentioning, again, Descartes or Auger, that I find very useful in his text about the non-places, or many others, or Eviatar Zubavel and Robert Elias, in the way I was talking to them, I was pretending to be part of a wider dialogue, and this helped me to say, this is a book about German Jews in the 1930s and the early 1940s, but this is also a book where I'm trying to speak with a more general public of readership. Now, I must say that at least in one of the revisions that I got from one of the journalists, they said, you do it too much. Please, who are you writing to? Are you trying to prove something? I think this was not my intention. And the test is the test in the pudding, as the proof in the pudding, as they say. I should add that one more challenge, and I think it's a real challenge. And again, you have to read the book to decide: is it's too deeply influenced by jargon? Because some of the books of some of our colleagues, and I use now one of the scholars that I heard many years ago and inspired me, said some books are very, very, very underinterpretation. They give you all the sources and you say, okay, what do you have to do about it? And some books are overinterpretation. They don't do a real work of sources, and even sometimes the context is not there. They just bring you a Foucault and Derrida, and okay, so what did I really learn about? I try to be in the middle. Is it successful or not? Again, it's yours to decide.
Let me press you on one thing on that, which is when you say, that is when you say that you turn to what you just said was you turn to theory in a dialogue with the theorists in order to engage in conversation with them. But and that you didn't make decisions about one theorist versus another theorist, really. But you made decisions. There are many, Descartes was one choice among a variety of, think about resistance and forms of resistance or agency. So is it that, what I was assuming when I was reading it, but maybe this was a projection because this is how I work, that I turn to theory when there are things I don't understand. And when I hit a puzzle in the sources and I can't figure out the story, that reading more and more sources or more and more context is not going to enable me to understand something.
Getting back to the question, the theories I use.
Yeah.
I didn't feel the need to say, now I want to say something about resistance. I have to look for all the theories about resistance and pick the one, thank you, and pick the one which I found most suitable. As long as it was good enough, I used it. And I didn't, now my line of thought is
you asked about, just remind me.
It's both how you chose the theory and, you know, that's, so, and but there's a question of good enough for what?
Yeah, okay.
That is it
Good enough for me, it's another way to use the word context. I mean, theories are very useful for conceptualizations, to say the way this individual or this group or this newspaper articles was describing the way they struggle with time can be labeled, it can be described, it can be conceptualized in this way, and this helps me to connect it to a wider context. It doesn't mean that I didn't understand it before. I mean, you say you use it when you don't understand. I could understand it before, but my story will be much more dull if I didn't use it. And I think that the theories and conceptualizations are making it, for me, much more interesting. I hope for my readers, because my challenge was to write something which was not only for those interested in specifically in German Jewish history, but also trying to convey something wider. And for this theory, I found it very useful.
Okay, I'm going to press once more and then I'm going to pass it on, Amma, which is thinking about the driving example that you just
Yeah.
gave, the Knappera.
Yeah.
Which is brilliant in the book. It's really, really great. And it's a part of the book I much like, among many others. But I wonder if you would have thought to focus on Knappera's driving in that part of that diary had you not already read Deserto. And that use of space and the thinking about movement through space. That is the question of what one notices in a text, how you, in a source, how you think about it. Because the reason the other people who've worked on Knappera haven't thought about that is partially their questions are different, but also the dialogues they're carrying on in their heads, who they're in interaction with are different. And so it's not just that you then kind of, I guess it's a question of what it means to make it more interesting, less dull. That it seemed to me it actually, I suspect it enabled you to see actually different things in the text.
No, definitely. I mean, reading the theories and also being exposed to projects from different contexts, like, as I said, the Central Bus Station of Tel Aviv, is opening my eyes to see what these German Jews are doing during this time, and that dealing with Jewish identity is not the only way he's writing, but driving or going to long walks after until the last moment before he has to be at home, and many other examples are very interesting and relevant. So it's definitely one more element which is part of what I did.
Yeah, I think I'll pick that up from the Klemper driving example, and I mean, I think one really interesting thing as the non-historian in the conversation, I mean, we were talking about kind of the different methodological frameworks from which we come. And for me, one thing that was very striking was the degree to which, kind of along the lines of what Leora was saying, that the book draws a very clear kind of frame, right? As you said also in your comments earlier, that what it is about sort of German Jews in the 30s and early 40s, right? But it constantly also makes us think about what is beyond that frame in different ways. I think, and there's some, to me, there was, by the end of the reading, it was quite clear that you were also thinking about that in more ways than one. And one of the senses in which that operates, it seems to me, is that the categories that you work with, space and time, they're so fundamental, right? And have a philosophical dimension and an anthropological dimension, and that the sort of the question of the degree to which what these people were dealing with is a universal experience, right? That one's relationship to one's home operates in certain ways, one's experience of time through the course of a day, a year, a lifetime, operates in kind of ways that we can theorize and think about. And then there's, in your opening remarks, you said this is a radical example, right? Like a radical case study. And so the question of what happens to these kind of universal experiences, as it were, or kind of anthropological dimensions of time and space in a radical situation, on the one hand. And then on the other hand, right, it's a very rich kind of account of daily life and experiences. There are a lot of these kind of biographies that are woven through, as Leora said. To me, that was one of the really gratifying aspects of reading the book, is like you get to know some of the main characters at different, like Victor Klemperer is driving here, and here in this next chapter he gets caught after curfew walking around,
hanging out in the cemetery.
right, and taking walks in the cemetery, and over time you kind of get but these lives kind of very often at the end of your paragraph, and now I speak as a literary scholar on your style, right? By the end of your paragraph, these lives either lead to their exile, their leaving Germany, or their deportation and their murder. And that's also this kind of repeatedly this moment in which you point us outside of the frame, right? That's not what the book is about, but we know that these are the two possibilities of trajectories, and I found that very striking as well. So I guess I'd be curious to hear you talk more about this issue of both kind of in terms of this particular history, what you chose to write about their experiences just before they leave or just before they are deported, and how that works as a kind of for you as a historian, but also this sort of going back to this question of you know, maybe not so much the déserteur, but or various kind of the anthropological theories of time and space that you use, and this question of kind of the radical example and what it shows about them to your mind.
Okay, so first let me start saying that in addition to these two options, Klemperer is representing the third one. He didn't immigrate and he was not deported. He just survived in Nazi Germany. But this is, of course, the exception. Of course, I could have, and one of the lectors of the book asked me to refer a little to the concentration camp. I think I did it very short in the conclusion. But this is not part of the book for a variety of reasons. I think first and foremost, when these people are immigrating or being sent to the death in the East, the sources are done. I mean, I don't have any more sources. I have to reinvent. It's another project. Because when Willy Krohn, let's pick another example, and later on maybe we'll speak not only about 50-year-old men who are professors, but maybe about women or children who are also part of this book. But the most heavy sources are for these two individuals. When he's sent to the East with his wife and two small daughters, he doesn't write the diary anymore. I cannot follow him even if I wanted. I can imagine what happened to him. So I leave you this line, and we can imagine together what happened to him. I cannot really write. I mean, if I wrote a fiction book, I could have continued it, but I didn't. So I don't have the sources anymore. Also, the press sources are not continuing, because after late 1938, there is not a real German Jewish press that I can use for this project. Furthermore, some at least of the individuals who immigrated, and I will give, unfortunately, another around 50 years old male, Kurt Rosenberg, they just immediately after immigrating, they stopped writing. And this is interesting. Why? Because what I say, and I think that after what we all experienced in COVID, that so many people were writing blogs and so much reflection about their life, because, and I wrote an article about it before COVID, instead of space of living, we had space of writing. And also these people, they did not really live, they could not really live in the full sense of using space in the way we do it. So they just wrote about themselves. And in the case of Rosenberg, when he started his new life, he didn't write anymore. And there are, I think, other cases like this. So this is and it gives me another good way to tell you that, okay, I tell that he immigrated, my project is over, and also his project of writing himself to death or to immigration is over. Now for the question of the radical example. I mean, the word that we didn't mention so far, and I really don't want to mention, and I urge all the students not to mention, is the word unique. Yeah, we spoke about it yesterday. And this comes from the discourse of the uniqueness of the Holocaust, which I also don't want to take part in. I think this is part of, I mean, what I did in this book is part of a general human experience. It's a radical case, I would say, because of two reasons. First, because the radical suffering of German Jews in this context. But this is not so special because so many other groups are suffering even today and were suffering from very harsh life conditions. What I think is more special, outstanding, pick your word unless you use unique, is the fact that they were very, very quickly deteriorating from a living situation of bourgeoisie with the cultural habitus of bourgeoisie, part of which were to document, to write about themselves, and to take pictures and make photo albums and write in the press and read in the press and express themselves culturally to a much more, proletarian style of life, and then a life-threatening. But still, they continue to use the cultural fortune, and this makes it such a rich case study that can tell us a lot also about other cases. And this is why I found German Jews so inspiring a case study. But again, the problems I discuss, and this is why I found the theory so useful, because these theories were not about German Jews. This is because the sources are so rich.
Again, to press a little on that, isn't there a contradiction? That is, if the writing was so inherent to this bourgeois culture before the war, before the oppression, that it is part of who they are, and that what's particular about the German Jewish experience, as you describe it, is having been comfortable, having been bourgeois, and having been in a writerly culture, then when they are under a situation of persecution, they turn even more to writing than they turned before, and that becomes a rich source base, but also their mode of existence, in a sense, their mode of survivance, is to go to the Wisner expression about that. That is maybe a really fundamentally different form of surviving and of existing and of remaining human under conditions of extreme oppression than someone who didn't have access to that writerly culture before and whose resources are fundamentally different. And so the question of how far you can generalize from this very particular rich case, given its peculiarities, put it that way, I would really wonder myself.
I can simply say that I agree. I mean, I did not claim, this is not a book in anthropology. When I say I take a case study and I want to prove something, I have a universal point of view. I think you're definitely right. I mean, I cannot prove that the way German Jews experienced and coped with their exclusion is representing the way in which, a population who doesn't have this cultural fortune, whatever, in any way did. Of course not. I mean, this actually what you say. I think I totally agree. I say that this is a very rich source to see how certain societies can cope with such a challenge. And again, I mean, see how you find yourself with this COVID experience, which was a very, very, very small example compared to what they experienced. But I mean, but when we lived through the first week of COVID and we didn't know where it's leading, I mean, there were also very pessimistic and catastrophic possibilities in our minds. In a way, we can imagine something a very little on what they felt, and we. At least us, academics, and we had this cultural fortune, and I think we used it in different ways.
I think taking it in a slightly different direction. I'm sort of imagining a conversation between, I'm channeling Leora here a little bit, but just wanted to ask you to speak more about the way in which this is a book about kind of domestic spaces and the bourgeois experience or kind of middle class experience, and there are certain kind of, you work primarily with textual sources and mostly with kind of ego documents like diaries and letters, and with the press a lot, but also kind of op-ed writing, that kind of material in the press. And so there's a kind of tension there potentially, I think, between, right, as you said, a lot of your sources are middle-aged men who are kind of at the point where they're reflecting in that, not exclusively at all, but many of them, and many of the important ones that give you a lot of material to think with. And yet, right, there are certain kind of you're interested in what happens to the domestic sphere in terms of access to food, in terms of how time is spent inside the home and outside the home. Yeah, so I guess, I don't know, maybe Leora wants to add, kind of sharpen that question or kind of clarify that line of questioning, but I think that's a really interesting aspect of the book, but a place where also it's like you're squaring a circle in some way, in kind of getting access to that domestic space through these kind of more reflective, kind of meta types of writing about it, or that give us kind of glimpses into it.
One thing I could add that I was thinking about reading that chapter, and also your discussion about the bourgeoisie, that actually reinforces an argument about being able to generalize from this case, and to contradict what I said earlier, which is that one of the sources I've used a lot for trying to think about these things are restitution documentation. And particularly the restitution documentation I've used from France, where you have the poorest of the poor reconstructing their homes from memory, that they had left through inventories and through letters. And in those, so these are people who are semi-literate and really very poor. What you find in those documents is an investment in domesticity in the home, a relation to the home, which is not different. The home itself is completely different. But you go from the documentation of somebody who had one room with 4 people in it and a sewing machine to the person who had 16 rooms and, but what comes through is the sameness, actually, about home, to go back to your beginning. So I guess it would be interesting to just to follow that.
Yeah, I mean, we were both talking with both of you today, and I said that my favorite chapter in this book is the 3rd chapter dealing with home. And this is also a great opportunity to speak a little about the gender aspect, which I implied before, because this is, I think, the chapter in which women are mostly represented, and the sources coming from women from different aspects are the most fruitful one. This has to do, of course, with the classic division of labor between men and women in the German Jewish bourgeoisie, as Miron Kaplan, was a very important inspiration for this project, I should say, was expressing in her work. And I found, for example, in the Jewish newspapers, there were, in addition to the editorials writing about German Jews versus the Nazi regime and immigration and economic stuff and vice versa, there were also women's supplements. And the women's supplements were dealing with domestic topics, and they were so interesting. Let me give you an example. One of the basic domestic experience they were using, and they were dealing with what do I do when I move from a 5-room apartment to a 2-room apartment. I mean, most of us, we still believe, I hope, in progress, and not only in general progress. This is, of course, very, very challenged. I come from Israel, but all over. I don't have to elaborate more. But still, we try to believe in progress and also in our personal life. Now I live in a small apartment. I hope to live in a bigger one, and my family will extend, and I will have more place for my books. Maybe one exception is, and I was asked about it by certain old people, is that when people are old and moving to a smaller location, and this is something that you can also get inspiration. But what will be happening to people around my age, or the much younger people here in the audience, will have to move from a 5-room apartment or even to a stairs home when the kids are upstairs and you're downstairs and everybody's happy and you've got your office and your partner's office. Now you have to move to the 2 rooms. Which of your objects you will say, okay, I cannot take everything with me. I have to give up most of my belongings. What do I take? What don't I take? What does it expressing? I think at the end, it's universal questions. And when I followed this in the women supplements in the journals, I found fascinating discussions about it. And what's very interesting, very different ideas. I mean, will you take only what is practically needed for having a life? What you need for the kitchen, what you need for making food, what you need to clean the house, maybe very few books, but not the luxuries, not the all the memories from your great grandfather. Or maybe this is the most important thing to take, and it's not a luxury because it has to your identity. It's a question. I don't have an answer. I can just show you that different German Jews, or mostly different German Jewish women writing about it, had different opinions about it. One of the fascinating sources for the correspondence of the German Jewish poet Gertrude Kolmar with her sister in Switzerland, and then she is relating. I mean, she was living with her father in their home. They were moving from the more rural area to Berlin, and then it became a Judenhaus, and more families got inside, and she's struggling to write her poetry during while living with more and more families and actually foreigners in the same domestic space. And this, I find it a heroic struggle. I mean, she's trying to put herself to create a privacy in a situation which is almost impossible. Another example, a family correspondence with a child who immigrated to Africa, and they are describing more and more families coming to share the same domestic space, but still they have a small space in the middle of the house, which they call neutralian. It's a neutral space. It's a kind of a shared space, because otherwise, if everything will be devoted to specific needs, there will not be this space that we need to share in a more fluid way. And again, I think these remnants of the bourgeois habitus I find as a heroic struggle, while others might say, this is kind of silly because they're all going to be massacred. The only thing they should have done is immigrating. I definitely don't share this experience. I see it as a very fascinating, in a way, also heroic struggle.
That's super interesting. I'm not so sure it's so bourgeois always, actually. That would be the thing that I would, again, I think there's a relationship to space that may come when you have the money to have more space. But I think a lot of what you're describing, which is a striving for dignity and a striving for self-realization. I mean, I asked you why you didn't use that because notion of Eigensinn at one point here, but a kind of notion of self-realization, autonomy, or peace in the household. It's the other thing with this neutralia. But I don't think,
to use Miron's book, Between Dignity and Despair.
yeah, right,
Exactly
yeah. But I wouldn't limit that to a bourgeois quality myself at all. I think that there was an equal, again, how people can live with dignity under very compressed circumstance and minimalist circumstance. The people who were poor had a long experience of it, which they continued into their new experience. And they were in some sense enabled. They had more that they came into this with pre-knowledge. And so one of the things that's interesting is would be actually the weakness of some of the bourgeois Jews who lost that struggle, because they were so appalled by the lack, they were so dependent on the materiality of their conditions before that they couldn't actually live. Some of them, and others could. I mean, so I think it varied, but I think the class stuff is really interesting, actually, and I would expand some of. I'm less convinced that some of what you're talking about is as bourgeois as those sources would suggest.
It's another opportunity to say, okay, I accept this critique. I mean, I will not say that necessarily this is a bourgeois thing, but I dealt with bourgeois people. Right. I mean, you cannot deny these German Jews are bourgeoisie, but maybe the implication are wider. And if I will do what I did do in the book, what I did in my previous book, think about how follow them to the next station, to the immigration. Necessarily when they came to Palestine, but maybe even here, I think they had to reinvent their bourgeois. I mean, I think they were still becoming bourgeois after immigration, but in a very different situation, and they have to give up many aspects of the way in which the bourgeois habitus was created in the German context, right, becoming much more flexible and open to new ways to define themselves, but still, if I think about the German Jews in Israel, which are mostly involved in my previous research, still keeping some of these basic values. This doesn't say, and I accept what you said, that this urge to save your dignity and save your domestic and home space is not only a bourgeois experience. Of course, I accept it.
I want, again, taking this in a little bit of a different direction, but on this issue of sort of the book is about how people dealt with this attack on their agency, on their autonomy, on their lives, right, on their livelihoods. And to me, one of this I ask as an avid reader of Arendt, as you've heard, is one of the things that she writes about during the 30s and the 40s, and then when she writes The Origins of Totalitarianism about this period of time, is she's very interested in kind of the capacity to be surprised by reality, or kind of the what it takes to encounter and countenance the unprecedented, right? And to her, that's a key kind of the capacity to be shocked and surprised by reality and to resist it, right? And to me, one of the really interesting things that emerges from your book, another way to kind of paraphrase what your book shows, is that on the one hand, this kind of the experiences of time and space, sometimes what you're showing us is how people kind of take models and ideas and even, I would say, cliches, right, that they had already, and kind of apply them. The notion of not having space, of feeling like, oh, I am constricted and space is limited. In some ways, it's like they're taking a kind of something that they already had in their arsenal and applying it to the situation. The sense of like, oh, time is moving both very slowly and very fast, right? That this was almost like a kind of anthropological kind of something in their toolkit as humans that they could apply to this situation. And then on the other, like something like the story about the Neutralian in the apartment becomes a kind of strategy, right, to use the Desertovian notion, to resist and to kind of remake and improvise within the given. And to me, I'm curious whether that sounds right to you, that this kind of the texts and the experiences that you show us move between this sort of the ways in which they take kind of categories that they already had and kind of use them in order to process what they're going through, versus this kind of bottom-up kind of improvisatory way. And I don't know exactly how this is tied, but to me also, it's also your capacity as a historian to surprise us and kind of all the surprising details. I didn't want this conversation to go by without mentioning, for example, my favorite detail in the whole book, which is when you talk about sports as part of the account of Jewish places and spaces, right? So you speak about how people practiced sport, like exercised and were sports viewership. And you mentioned the fact that in June 1937, Maccabi Avshalom Petach Tikva handball team from Palestine played a game in Grunewald, Berlin, right? And it's that, the specificity of that and the utter strangeness of it and
It's not
unexpectedness.
supposed to be, but it
Right,
works.
but I think the book is, you're really interested also in those kinds of, like, the way that what we think we know about Berlin in 1937, when you get into the weeds, it surprises us, right? And the kind of the capacity to tell this story and keep kind of experiencing surprise in it through all these kind of daily weird sort of the stuff of daily life, I found really, really interesting and resonant precisely with the kind of the question of whether the people experiencing it had to kind of move it through the kind of this sausage maker of their kind of the cliches that they have about human experience versus the element of strategy and pushback.
Yeah, I see what you said more as a reflection than a specific question. So I have two comments, two reflections to make. The first one has to do with what you said about this started heaven, and this is not what we expect it to be. I remember many years ago, when I was really young, I gave a talk about German Jewish life in the 1930s, and when you do it in Israel in different places, most of the people coming are from German Jewish background. And back then, the old people who came were still, survivors of this period, mostly as children, when we think about the 90s. So I spoke about, and I came with, a very systematic process in 1933, these laws, and then in 95, this law, and then in 1937, it became more and more difficult. And then one of the people in the crowd, and you might remember it from Israel, he was then quite old, but before this, he was a member of the Knesset, and Mordechai Vershuvsky. He was a member of it. Anyway, he told me, what are you talking about? I remember vividly, until 1937, we were going to vacation in Italy every few months, and we were going to ski, and we had a good life, and you're describing something so different. It's very diverse. It's very diverse, and until 1938, the experience of German Jews in different places in Germany, it was much more difficult to be a Jew in Munich than in Hamburg, which was more open. It was, like always is still today, much easier to survive and to have decent life if you have more money than you're very poor. And there were a lot of exceptions, and sometimes your neighbors were nice to you. Sometimes even the Nazis in your neighborhood were a little more human, or not so radical anti-Semites, until 1938 came and changed it. So this is about the big diversity there, and we find something that we didn't expect. And yes, I wanted to show this to you. The other thing, which is deeper, and think about ourselves. And again, COVID is a very good case study. I think that before I came to this topic, and I was living a few decades, and I can assure you, I lived in time and space, and I didn't think about it so much, because normally we just live our life and we don't think all the time about time and space. We begin to think about it, unless we write an academic book, when we don't have enough time and space. It's like, air. We breathe the air all the time. We need it on a daily basis, on a minute basis, on a second basis, but you don't think about it. When are you going to begin to think about air? When you don't have it, when you feel it's. I think they began to elaborate about it and to write about it so much because they needed it. When I thought about it was when I was a few years ago, I was visiting in the States, and I went to New York City, and I went out from the subway, and I saw around myself the word space mentioned so times. Space to this space. Why? Because this is what you need in New York City. You don't have enough space, so you publish it, and you publicize it, and you advertise it, and you hire it, and you rent it, because you don't have it so much. You have to reflect about it, and you have to rent it for a certain time. And in a way, these German Jews dealt with it so much, and developing these strategies, because they didn't have enough space and they didn't have agency to control their time. So this is in a way the way I elaborate.
Shifting again a little, that we're gonna exhaust you completely. That I wanted to get you to talk more about how Judaism matters in the book. They're German Jews, and they're subject to persecution. So that's so they're that's the obvious. But one of the things that's I think super interesting and important about the book is that you move between the detailing of how German Jews are turned into Jews by the Nazis. And including people who didn't conceive of themselves particularly as Jews before, and the ways in which even Jews who had been fully Jewish, self-conceived as Jewish before, become in some ways more Jewish in the context, in daily life and daily practice. And I guess one of the questions, that's a well-known story in a way, but again, it's in the fine-grained details, which we just haven't addressed much, that emerge very clearly in the book. And you mentioned it quickly in passing about the new uses of cemeteries and new uses of synagogues. So it's both the ways in which Jews use Judaism as they are constructed as Jews in this new way, and also how Jewish practice changes. So the synagogue becomes a different kind of Jewish space, and the cemetery a different kind of Jewish space. So, and how much you think that prehistory matters in this? I mean, how much is the prehistory of German Jewish life constructed by Jews, and how much is it just a consequence of persecution and the ways in which Jews are given a certain domain of freedom under a domination, as long as they behave along as Jews in a Jewish context. So that perversion, and I mean particular perversion of German persecution.
Yeah, thank you for this question, because we dealt too much with bourgeoisie and too less with Judaism. So I think the first distinction I want to propose, I think it's very useful when we speak about German Jews and other Jews, certainly in the more liberal emancipated world, is a distinction between Judaism and Jewishness. Because many of these individuals are experiencing their Jewishness by, being Jewish as a minority and now as persecuted individual or family, which might not have anything or so much to do with Judaism, but it's still something that I experience and I have to grant meaning to. Whereas Judaism has to do with the way I relate to this cultural, religious, linguistic background I bring with me. I think that what the Nazis tried to do, and this is, the basic historiographical context, is that in the first years of the Nazi regime, basically until 1938, they were trying to isolate German Jews as much as possible and to cancel their emancipation, which means to recreate them as a group which is excluded from the German society, and maybe to get back to 200 years before, after the laws of Nuremberg in 1935, you could not even use the word German Jewish, Deutsch Jüdische something, but you have to say only Juden in Deutschland, Jews in Germany. This is part of what my colleague and friend Thomas Pegelow-Kaplan calls the Nazi linguistic violence. So, and this is what they were forced to do. Now, I think that some of the German Jews, and this is very clearly in the public space, they found that Judaism, in a variety of ways, is a resource that they can use. First of all, a resource that they can use, and the Nazis will not say to them, you can't use it, because at least for the short time, this was a kind of a common interest. The Nazis wanted to become more Jewish, and they said, we want to become more Jewish. And it may use them to grant meaning to what they were living through and to, live a more bearable life. So I think in the beginning, if you roughly divide German Jews to three main groups. The major group, the main group are the liberal, more integrated and maybe assimilated. It's a problematic word. The liberals, and the two other groups are the Zionists and the Orthodox. So in a way, it was easier to the Zionists and the Orthodox to cope with the situation because they have the answer. They said, we knew it, or we want to be more attached. And for me, the most interesting individuals and also the most interesting public spheres were these liberals who tried to come to terms with their Judaism in different ways. For example, in the chapter about calendars, I showed how the Jewish calendars are becoming much more loaded with Jewish holidays, even Jewish holidays which are very peripheral and not so important are becoming to be meaningful. Sometimes this Judaism and Jewish attachment is being expressed in a way that you see critically and say, it's not so different than the way the Germans are expecting their Germanness. When the Zionist movement is saying, we are united to the Zionist ideas, and they say, ein Volk, ein Land, ein Sprache, which means one nation, the Jewish nation, one land, the land of Israel, and one language. It sounds like, ein Volk, ein Reich. And this is only one example to say that it's also part of, adapting to the new situation. Now, synagogues are becoming places which people come much more to, partly because they need more religious space to encounter God. But this, I think, from my impression, is a minority. The Orthodox were expecting that there would be a huge wave of getting back a tshuva, as they call it in Hebrew, getting back and becoming. This didn't really happen. People mostly came to synagogue because they wanted to meet other people and be with other Jews, and most of the other public spaces were not open to them, at least to feel free to be among other Jews. And what I found fascinating is in one of the articles they were saying, you know, we called it in Hebrew Bet Knesset, which is house of gathering. And then during the Emancipation era, and there's a classic article of Michael Meyer that I cite, it did not exist as Beit Knesset, house of gathering anymore, because Jews were all over. And they were meeting in different variety of public spaces as German and also as Jews. But now, when all these public spaces are taken by the Nazi authorities one by one, they need to gather again, and the synagogue is becoming again from a house of prayer to house of gathering, and you do many other cultural activities, social activities. You mentioned sports, even sport activities are being conducted in the space of synagogue, because this is the space they have, and it's loaded with a lot of meaning. And the same, and this is a little more, dark, also the cemeteries are becoming much more popular. First, people going more to funerals, trying to think more about memory, trying to encounter their fathers and forefathers and discuss with them what is actually happening. And then it's just the only place where they're really free as Jews, the last place where Jewish children could play under blue sky were the cemeteries, Jewish cemeteries. It's as crazy as it sounds, and they were actually discussing it. So is it necessarily more Judaism or Jewishness? I think it's an interesting question.
I want to reserve at least a little time for
Yeah,
questions,
yeah.
but maybe what I'll suggest is that we'll take questions, one or two questions, and then we can direct not only to Professor Miron, but maybe if you want to mediate them through some of the concerns you have yet to address. So if there are questions, yeah, please, Elena.
Thank you so much for this great discussion. I have two questions. The first is about your experience translating this book and working with a translator to render an academic book that you composed in Hebrew into English. In the conclusion you mentioned, or maybe in the introduction, you mentioned that the process of translation caused you to revisit your interpretation of a few sources. So I'm curious if you could say something more about that. I'm also curious if your book has sort of how you think about the relationship between space and time. So there's sort of, you treat space and then you treat time. And while I was reading it, I got the feeling that without the exclusion from public space, some of the transformations of time that you catalog would not have happened, or would not have happened in the same way. So I'm curious, it seems like a big contribution of this book is thinking through space and time together, but I would love to hear more about what your argument is about how they're related under conditions of persecution.
Okay, your first question is easier for me. Second, I might have to reflect a little. So first, this is the opportunity to thank a lot and mention Chaim Watzman, the translator of my book. I can mention before that I published my previous book in English too, but then I did not have the money and the budget, the resources, so I translated it myself with my English, which is a very Israeli one, and it was edited. It was very long process, and I don't recommend it. So I picked the best translator, and it took me, and I had to wait for him, and he told me that it's going to be a long process because I will ask you many questions, and it was a long dialogue. And actually, it's a real translation is a new creation, and this is the creation of both the original writer and the translator. And during this process, I found quite a lot of things which had to be corrected. And by the way, in a few months there will be also a German version. And also in the German translation, my German translator Almut Laufer from Jerusalem, she also found not so many, but a few other cases to not only to correct, but to think about. And you didn't understand the source. Not only a small. In this case, reading on the source, maybe you misinterpreted it, and it's a real process. And getting back to the original language was a real challenge. Now about your question about time and space, I actually have to think about it. Let me put it this way. My decision to divide the book into two parts is only one option. it could have been done differently. I mean, if you will write a book about the Jewish space and time in Poland, I would not necessarily recommend you to divide it into parts. You might do it in a very different way and try to see how both are integrated. For example, how you connect more systematically between space, which is condensed and condensed and condensed, and the way time is stretching. Yeah, when Klemperer was arrested for 2 weeks, and he was counting the minutes and the seconds of being condensed, and I cannot not think about, the hostages today. If I give another example, not only COVID, and I think about how they come to terms with time, so it could have been written differently. You're definitely right. I chose one strategy of writing, and it's definitely can be done differently.
Thank you. I might have missed something because I came a little late, but I had also two questions. One is kind of tying this book to other projects of yours where you're thinking about German diasporas, because some of the experiences that you're talking about, like trying, for example, to battle to maintain a bourgeoisie lifestyle under different conditions, happen also in diasporas of German Jews. So I can think about, German Jewish migrants in mandatory Palestine, trying to, play the piano, maybe drive, maybe maintain a certain space in an apartment they have, and now they have to share with a whole bunch of people. So obviously these are different contexts, but I can definitely see continuities in kind of trying to maintain the German middle class lifestyle, writing the diaries, documenting this. And I wonder if there's a sense of continuity that you see between these projects and the kind of the battle to maintain bourgeois spaces in diasporic spaces, German Jewish diasporic spaces. And my second question has to do with sort of how you think about space in relationship to how sort of the state defines space. And I'm thinking here about Boaz Neumann's work, who wrote a lot about sort of how the Germans kind of conceptualized the role of Jews in space, and he kind of carries this story up until the concentration camps, where he connects kind of bodies with marginalization as kind of a state project. So I wonder if you could talk about this relationship as well.
Okay, so for the first question, it goes back to what we discussed and I think in our last question about the framing of my book. I mean, this project is about German Jews under the Nazi regime, but in a way, like what you asked before, I mean, I could have framed it differently. I could have worked, and make more connections to the context of the diaspora. I might do it maybe in future articles. And when I deal now with German Jewish diaspora, or when in my dissertation and my first book, which was not translated to English, I dealt with the memoirs of German Jews written in Palestine. They definitely dealt specifically with problems of space, problems of home, how you recreate your home in a totally different situation. Also, another new project I'm dealing with has to do with Jews and German nature. When you move from a cold place, and for me, the last days in Chicago experiences, I would say a little colder experience than my winter, much warmer winter, too warm, I would say, in Israel. And you move from a warm space, from a cold space to a warm space. The very experience of home and domestic is changed. I mean, one of the theories I read was saying that it's not a coincidence that in English and German, you have two different words for home and house, whereas in more Mediterranean languages, including Hebrew, you have the word bait for both of them, because the distinction between the inner and the out, the indoors and outdoors, is much more crucial in cold weather. And when these German Jews are moving to a more warmer places, like the places from which Iraqi Jews came, since you asked this question, it was also a different domestic experience. So there was definitely a continuity line in the question which can be asked, and other projects could have been written this way, and maybe I would do it in the future. Now, the second question was about, yeah, well, this is again the tension between the Nazi strategy, which is trying to impose very violently from above its spatial perceptions, like the linguistic violence I mentioned before, and the trying of the way Jewish individuals and Jewish communities or social or publicists are trying to come to terms with this and still keep their own sense of space. So the Nazis did not care about synagogues and cemeteries and different Jewish sport. But as long Jews could preserve their own spatial distinctions and not only obey the Nazi way in which they created space, they did it. You could ask, and this is again an opportunity for another project, what happened in the concentration camp when the Jews, and this goes back to Arendt also, when the Jews were, stripped from almost any possibility to resist, and they were imposed to experience the Nazi space as the Nazis imagine it. I would still dare to say that you will find even there, maybe very, very sad, still struggle for agency. But again, it's another project.
I think maybe one more question, then we'll give everyone a chance to complete the discussion.
This book is about German Jews. Had you written a book about the Jews of Vilna, do you think that your findings would be very different? In other words, you've analyzed how German Jews modified their use of time and space, how time appeared different to them because of their experiences. Well, the Jews of Vilna were also very bourgeois, and they were also writers, and they were also respected in their city. Would the data be different?
Okay, I can only speculate, but it's an interesting exercise to do it. So first of all, I had to cooperate with Ken or with a scholar of Eastern Europe who commands all the languages. I could use, of course, Hebrew, but I need more Yiddish and maybe Russian. I think it would have been different because of the mere reason that the German Jews had this 6 or 5 years living under the Nazi regime and being and the rights are taken for them in a more graduate way, whereas Jews in Vilna were far from living in an ideal situation. Life in Poland in the interwar period, and as you know, Vilna was part of Poland at this time, was far from being ideal for the Jews, but they did not experience. I mean, they had the terrible problems of standards of life, the extreme poverty, and problems like this. But in terms of the limitations of space and time, I did not think they experienced such a systematic exclusion. It was much more sudden, and this means that they probably did not have also the time to create the sources. Like the sources I'm using, the sources were much more, much fewer because of the situation. Let's even compare it to the Jews of Vienna. I mean, I dealt with German Jews and not with Viennese Jews. For Viennese Jews, it was much more abrupt from March 1930. So this has to do a lot with the circumstances. You're definitely right that in terms of bourgeoisie, the Jews of Vienna, the Jews of other places, Prague, you can think about France, basically come from quite similar version. Each community thought itself as unique. I think the circumstances of the exposure to Nazi persecution policy is different, and this makes my sources so rich.
Yeah, I would only add that it also matters that there were German Jews being attacked by the German state. That it mattered, Germans against Germans. I think it matters. I mean, maybe not specifically for the time-space question, but I think it matters a lot for the experience. If it can be attributed to an external invader, as opposed to if it's your own, you're turned on by your own state and your own people. I just wanted to add in terms of something that I really appreciated in the book, and that people should. That is the maps. Since Nama got to mention her favorite part, I think mine was I'm going to lose the page number, but the maps that were the 34 and 37 maps that look. I don't know where.
Yeah, it's both taken from a children's supplement in Jewish newspapers, and they're showing, I don't know how to refer to it in English, different games of children, games, kekubeya as we call it in Hebrew. One in 1934 is showing you how you go around Germany and visit a variety of Jewish places and spaces, which means the basic experience for a Jewish child, or the basic experience that the Jewish educator or adult writer want to tell this child, that you should know that you're still in Germany and Germany is becoming a very Jewish Germany for you. The other one is Wir fahren nach Australia. Now the basic experience that we have to educate our child is how to go all the way from Germany to the end of the world to Australia.
Yeah, no, it's just, it's an incredibly graphic demonstration of what you're talking about in a very, in that everydayness.
Final questions or comments?
You should read the book.
And on Australia.
So maybe last thing I want to say, this goes back to some of the questions, especially from the younger students, is I want to say again, such a book could have been written in a variety of ways. I mean, I chose one way. One of the questions I was asked once, I mean, you could have write the whole book according to the different senses, seeing, hearing, smelling. It's a fascinating project. I just didn't do it. And then I would have to read other theories and read my sources differently. And the sources are still there. They're waiting for more and more historians to ask you questions, and there's much more work to be done.